Hello. Thanks for tuning in to my conversation with Gregg Henriques. So I've had him on a number of times. So before I give some context, there's some housekeeping. If you are interested in circling and going deeper into personal exploration that a lot of what underlies these conversations are involved for me, I teach through my company, the Circling Institute. And it's an opportunity just to do in a very experiential way the spirit of what you're seeing here on these channels, and to go really deep with that. So we have things on Thursday night. We have a weekend coming up, and we are accepting registrations for the Art of Circling, which is the year-long course, and much, much more. So all the links for that are below. Also, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, in coaching, just go ahead and email me, and my email's below. Cool. So really enjoyed this conversation with Gregg. I'll warn you, we get into some of the weeds because what we ended up talking about has a lot of technical aspects from it that I was interested in hearing about. However, I would encourage you. I think it's worth it. Like stick through some of the technicalities. In fact, I want to encourage that with all these conversations. I know that I don't always understand what we're talking about, or especially with some of the people that I'm talking with, they're just, some of it's really over my head and not completely comprehensible. However, by sticking with it, I've often been surprised how much more I was comprehending than I had initially thought, and that the act of attempting to comprehend it in itself was growthful, right? In surprising ways. So I would just want to encourage that with all the conversations, but here with Gregg especially. So we go a lot into his experience of the series that he did with John Vervaeke in untying the knot of consciousness. We go deep into that and talk about this really cool thing that's happened for him personally, or something coming together for like a real deep kind of, almost you could say, an implicit, I would say, spiritual experience, much lower, like in his chest, that's opened up for him that was really interesting to hear about and to get close to, and made me super happy for him. All right, so I think that's all context I think I can give. Enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
They talk about world knot and wisdom energy and all that good stuff.
Welcome, Gregg.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Good to see your friend.
It's good to share a flat screen of light with you again.
Amen. Amen.
I trust your.
You got a lot more depth than this two-dimensional experience. At least I'm feeling it.
Totally. So a couple of things that it struck my interest, right, around a couple of things. There's an insight that you had around this distinction called wisdom energy that seemed very connected to a lot of the conversations that you've been having, right, with John and with Jordan. And then you've been doing this series called Untying, what is the knot of consciousness, or the
untangling the world knot, from a Schopenhauer reference of consciousness. Grappling with the hard problems, mind and matter.
Right, totally.
See it at your local YouTube.
So I jokingly asked you, like, well, have you untied it yet? And you're like, I was surprised. You're like, gotten pretty close.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So I mean, the structure of that is that, John, I think, the way I describe John is that he is an integrative cognitive scientist. John Vervaeke, of course, is the guy who did it with him. And he had a very, very powerful set of insights to organize human cognitive science, consolidated, and in a meta-theoretical way that's very similar to the way I approach psychology, or at least the kind of the engagement. And so what John developed was a way of thinking about sort of the function and nature of cognition into consciousness, which folks may know is called he emphasizes relevance realization.
Mm-hmm.
It's really recursive relevance realization.
Yeah.
And what that means is that the cognitive system is engaged in a process of identifying what's salient and relevant in landscape.
Mm-hmm.
But as he emphasizes, there's no real theory of relevance per se, but there's this theory of relevance realization, which puts the agent arena relationship in focus, and then creates, he uses the term realize both to mean to see and to create. And it is that dynamic process of detecting what is relevant and salient, realizing that in engagement, and then actually he's got what's called scale invariant recursive modeling, which basically is across the layers. There's constant iterative feedback within the hierarchy and then between the animal and the environment. There's constantly modeling between various domains to create, and ultimately consciousness is a kind of, so this recursive relevance realization creates a model of cognition. When you talk, I often will talk about neurocognitive functionalism. That's the idea that the nervous system is an information processing system. And so recursive relevance realization, really scale invariant recursive relevance realization, is a meta theory for understanding the nature and function of cognition. And so that's what John did, is that he extracted very, very powerful principles that could cut across a wide variety of different other approaches, but consolidate them, see how they're integrated, and then pull core principles of understanding together. And he does it in a way that also, he adds to this his taxonomy of knowing, that there are 4 different kinds of ways in which we know: procedural knowing, participatory knowing, perspectival knowing, and propositional knowing. That's his taxonomy of knowing. And he ties this also together to apply it to this general principle of cognition, recursive relevance realization across scale, into what does it mean for intelligence, especially fluid intelligence at one level, and how does it look when we look at consciousness? And by that we mean the subjective experience of being from behind the eye, mostly, although that word, we spend a lot of time problematizing the word, meaning that we want to make sure is it awareness? Is it self-consciousness? Is it,
what did you call it? The subjective what of awareness of being?
I refer to it as, subjective conscious experience, SCE, really. And subject, there's 2 issues here. There's the subjective versus objective, which is the epistemological issue, meaning you cannot see directly another person's subjectivity, versus the third person. That's a Wilbur quadrant view. And then conscious experience refers to the what we are talking about. And that is what Nagel called, what is it like to be about? It's the thing that it is like to be from a first person perspective. So subjective conscious experience is that's the primary reference point. And so John develops this map that says, hey, here is a map of knowing. Here is a core structure function that also captures phenomenology and integrates a wide variety of different domains. And he lives in cognitive science and philosophy. And of course, that overlaps a lot with psychology, but then I come in from clinical psychology and have this problem of psychology and this way to box in the field of psychology. And then, you have...
Just really quick, so I'm clear, because I have been wondering about this. What essentially, if there's a simple way of putting it, what is the difference between like a cognitive science, right, and the science of psychology?
Great, it's a great question. Essentially, so my whole point about the science of psychology is that it's poorly defined because we don't have a proper conceptual map to understand it. If we had a proper conceptual map, cognitive science would never have emerged. Cognitive science breaks off from psychology because psychology is so completely confused.
Okay, got you.
So psychology gives rise to the behavioral science. And then the behavioral sciences blend into biological behavioral sciences, like what's called ethology. Ethology is the science of animal behavior. But they are now biologists. okay,
Oh,
generally.
interesting. Yeah.
But they used to be in the 19th century, they were all comparative psychologists. So the first science of animal is animal mental behavior processes, and comparative psychology is that's now ethology. My point of it is we didn't know what the term behavior meant.
Yeah.
So they built this concept of behavioral sciences, and then it spreads. And then in the 1940s into 50s, you get the cybernetic revolution and the artificial intelligence and computer revolutions. And all of that's actually then becomes, in the 1950s, the cognitive revolution.
Yeah.
Which offers a new ontology of mind as an information processing system, whatever that might mean.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, because there's still a real strong behavioral tradition in psychology, which is defined then as the science of behavior and mental process, there's some people that break off and they're like, well, it's just there's the science of the mental. There was cognitive psychology. Now, cognitive psychology is essentially exactly where cognitive science was. But it then also jumped into artificial intelligence. It made connections to linguistics and the philosophy of mind. And now what it's generally, when you talk about cognitive science, it's this complex, interdisciplinary complex that overlaps with psychology, anthropology, linguistics, philosophy of mind, and artificial intelligence and computer science. So that's like, those are the 6 big clusters. So if you identify with cognitive science, you're sort of that interdisciplinary. And it's funny, there's actually now, by the way, there's consciousness studies, which is like a subset, and whether they're part of cognitive science or not. There are all these different kind of. My argument, that's all part of the, it's the downstream consequence of the Enlightenment gap in our, we don't know what we don't have the right vocabulary. So I'm, I come at it slightly differently, but there is a big difference. I mean, in terms of some difference, but for me, the psychology really would have, the science of psychology, what we call cognitive science, would have been a part of it, but it's just organized.
Right. Okay. Got it. Totally got it. And so, and then just kind of going back to the relevance realization and everything that's describing, right? There's that kind of quality of where John in that is it's basically it's trying to give theory or spell out the structural dynamics that is it fair to say this is like, it's the place where how is it that as an agent, right, I respond to the environment that reveals the environment, but then simultaneously co-reveals the agent, right, in such a way that reveals, and that when that goes really well, right, that agent arena relationship and the relevance of where you should put your attention and how to respond and how to participate, the world and yourself opens in exponential, surprising ways, right?
Yes.
And when that doesn't go well, right, it there are things like addiction and roadblocks and
absolutely,
right, all that kind of thing.
So for John's finding consciousness as in the focal emphasis of perspective and participation. There's 2 of his knowing. So perspective is just behind the eyes, what you see. Participate, when you start moving your hands, you're now engaging behaviorally at part of the agent environment arena. The dynamic intersection of really what I would call mental behavior, overt mental behavior, and subjective conscious experience. So that's perspectival. And what he captures is, recursive relevance realization is a great way to, I saw you did a video on perception, like a 3-minute video on perception. You were out there and you were saying, hey, we have the naive realist view, which is, hey, I look out and I see a tree, right? Okay. And then sometime when you're a kid, it dawned on you, it's like, well, wait a minute, where the fuck is that tree that I'm seeing? Like, isn't it in my head too?
Right.
But if I cut my head open, you just get a brain, you don't get a tree, right? And it dawns on you, like, where is the tree? And it's like, sort of in your head and sort of out there. And we've been struggling with that question for a long time.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And I was like, sort of out there and sort of in here. Well, recursive relevance realization allows you to see a frame for understanding the structure of of hierarchical cognitive processing. It's an integrative view of information. Its function, what is it actually doing? It's engaging recursive relevance realization. And when you get focal attention, okay, you will then have an understanding of what actually is happening with consciousness, which is a focal recursive relevance realization, where an object, a figure pops that becomes intentional, meaning that has the aboutness of it, of the experience that you then you bring your top down and bottom up together around a focal point, and then the figure of, say, the tree pops out at you. And the meaning's already in it, like the tree, oh, it affords us beauty, or oh, it's a stressor that if I don't duck, I'm going to cut myself on the branch, or oh, it affords me, shade. I mean, that you instantaneously see, and that's what behavioral investment theory, which is part of my frame, immediately affords. This is like actually, it's a model that explains why we're structured to see affordances, as Gibson talked about, as ecological perceptual theorist, and John's all part of that. So, so the super cool thing, actually, if I can share my screen, I'll show you a slide really fast. That might be helpful for.
Let me give you. I think I just have to make you host. There you go. Now it's officially your show.
All right, fantastic. So what I'm doing is I'm going to bring up a slide that I enjoyed making. Okay, so this represents John's recursive relevance realization. Notice the big V for Johnny V. All right. It's also it also represents the scales across the hierarchical scales. There's recursive modeling between things. Okay. And what John has afforded, in my estimation, and this is what I think he would say he's trying to do, and what I think he's done, is then create a meta theory of cognition, and really human cognition, or the cognitive information. What is the structure and function of the informational system that is the nervous system? What do we mean by that information side? So, I mean, I had the system as an information system, but I didn't have a refined function structure analysis. But I had systems that could help make sense out of aspects of it. So then what you have is, well, if John is building a model of cognitive science and I'm building an integrative model of psychology, how do the puzzle pieces go together? Okay? And what the back half of so John lays out his arguments for the first 7 episodes, or whatever, and I'm talking in the world not, and I'm listening and playing along and learning what it is that he's telling. And then the last third is showing how I take the primary role, and I then explain to him behavioral investment theory, the influence matrix, and the justification systems theory, and show, and this is what I'll show here, that we come to the end of that, and when we're summarizing that, we're both full in agreement that the tree of knowledge provides sort of our big history map of the domain. So now now we can map up on sort of our naturalist worldview and the big categories of it, and how this provides a frame for both reality, the matter, life, mind, and culture, and the scientific theories of it. We also then mapped up, so I have this part of my whole book that I'm working on is mapping mind 1, 2, 3. Okay. And his 4 modes of knowing: procedural knowing, which really corresponds to my mind 1, participatory and perspectival corresponds to mind 2, and mind 1 in action, like when you're engaged here. And then propositional, the justification systems theory is a theory of propositional. So there's an enormous, so our taxonomy line up and our functional theories line up. So our metaphysical concepts and our meta theory concepts. And I think that's a big deal. And my argument is that actually, this is really the first time that I'm aware that 2 broad theoretical systems have actually been merged together. Normally, people propose their theories and then they just, they operate within them. I don't remember a synergy for 2 fundamentally interdisciplinary, different people developing theories and then explicitly coming together to see their interrelation.
So to emphasize big deal, what you mean is basically this covers everything.
I think this basic, to my estimation,
Mm-hmm.
you look at the current state of affairs in psychology and cognitive science, and you see chaos. I mean,
Yeah.
there's consensus that there's complete chaos.
Right.
Okay. And everyone in science generally agrees that coherence and integration, to the extent that you can achieve it, is much of what we're seeking. That's what consensual analysis. You look at Maxwell, you look at Einstein, I mean, that's what so this is very exciting in the sense that there's actually now a meta-theoretical, metaphysical alignment between cognitive science and psychology.
Yeah.
And so what we did on one session, after we reviewed this, we showed that that behavioral investment theory, which forms the base and the frame, sort of the evolutionary behavioral frame for neurocognition, fits in directly. Okay. And in fact, we were able to sort out some initial misalignments into something that then actually deepened John's understanding, and we came more online to understand the evolution of consciousness in animals, and the various data that's available to see. Because John had not integrated a lot of pleasure and pain in relationship to his thinking, although he kept mentioning it. Fundamentally care is to make the Heidegger connection. Ultimately, all relevance realization requires care at some level, which would be the positive and negative evaluations. And so we were actually talking about he makes a very important distinction, which I find to be very useful, around what's called adjectival qualia. That's the experience of green, or the experience of trees, and adverbial qualia, which is actually the here-ness, now-ness, aspectualizing feature of consciousness.
Right.
It's sort of the difference between inside, you have what you perceive, I perceive, and then the experience of a perceiver. What you perceive is the adjective, and then your perceiver is doing doing sexualizing, or the here-ness, now-ness together, and that's your adverbial structure. Okay. So we then were exploring the evolution of this, and then talking about sort of, well, how does relevance realization? What it's really about is cultivating the path of investment. And I was like, and I think that pleasure and pain were the first signals to guide the participatory learning dynamic structure. Okay, it's a signal. And he's like, oh, of course. So the valence qualia, the core valence qualia, which actually we then were like, hey, that's kind of what would emerge first, was this broadcast function, embodied broadcast to move toward and away. And ultimately, then that's going to then set up that. And indeed, I'm reading much on the evolution of animal consciousness. I really believe that that's essentially what happens is you get these valence broadcasts qualia, which are essentially the first elements that are really organizing the attention of the animal towards a focal point. And that's what you see sort of in insects and probably and fish and things like that.
And what you mean by the valence function is that you start to see organisms that have the ability to extend beyond themselves in some sense and anticipate and respond to what's pleasurable and what's pain, and then organize around that. Okay.
Exactly. So if you can't, it's hard to see, but this says perception, motivation, and emotion.
Right.
And basically perception is what you have exterioception, which basically I'm going to have senses of the outside world. I'm going to bring that in.
Right.
Okay. Then you have interioception, which is basically the state of your body and your motivational drive states. That's where you want to be homeostatically.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you have emotion, which is energized motion. Okay. That responds in relationship to where you are and where you want to be. Okay.
Right.
So that's the way, that's the basic cybernetic or control theory guidance system, is that, so for example, if you're hungry and it's breakfast, okay. And you're sitting there and you're like, oh, I want an egg. You will activate then an image of you eating an egg, the perfect egg. Okay? And then you'll see where you are on the couch. And what you'll actually do is you'll break into a bunch of sub-routine goals. Okay. It says, oh, I need to get up. I need to move over to the fridge. I need to, in each one of those, you have a goal state you're barely conscious of, that you down-regulated all this procedural awareness generally. But basically, you then are reducing the goal state. Okay.
Yeah.
And you'll get jolts of pleasure as long as you're moved toward goal. is on target or better. So the efficiency of goal gives you pleasure every time you actually do that. You get a little, you open up the fridge to get eggs, you actually, if you're successful, you get a little jolt. Okay? If the fridge blocked, you're like, oh my God, what happened? You know, then all of a sudden you get routine interruption, you get surprised, you become more conscious of what's going on, and you do problem solving, and you experience a jolt of frustration to reduce the obstacle.
Right. Okay. Got it. So it would be something like, so just kind of working this out, it'd be something like, in terms of evolution, it'd be something like very, very early life, just like a little amoebic half organism or something. It's just,
yeah, exactly.
It's just, it starts to experience on some level pain and pleasure, but then as it evolves, it starts to anticipate it and respond to it one over the other. Right. Okay.
Right. This book right here that just came out is really great. I'm reading through it. It's called The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. That's a reference to Aristotle. And it makes the argument that what they call unlimited associative learning, which is basically the kind of learning I was just describing, the perception, motivation, emotion cluster, that cluster gets tagged with valence, and that they argue is really, if you look at the brain and you look at behavior and look at functionality, that's when it comes off the reflex and then becomes integrated to create a unified experience.
Right.
And that probably is happening around the early vertebrates. We're really not sure whether it happens like with insects. Probably doesn't happen with the simplest like amoeba and worms and things like that, because they don't have enough real stacked integration. And they don't demonstrate, they basically demonstrate associative learning and reflexes, not the much more dynamic instrumental, what they call unlimited associative learning, which is basically what John would call a much more participatory as opposed to reflexive mode. So the argument is that participatory modes of knowing come on, you start getting in what John would call an adverbial broadcast function. Because it's sexualizing aspects of existence. Now, and my feeling is that this is basically very flashy, meaning that it's very brief. You get jolts of it, but it's probably brief in things like, if it's present in insects at all, it's probably very quick, meaning that it would be like sensory perceptual, 1/3 of a second to a second. What you see another jump in birds and mammals, where you get the neocortex, and in birds the palladium, and then there's a cortical thalamic loop that the global workspace people identify, and that's probably associated really with the inner experience, the full experience of subjective conscious experience, that has the difference of a perceiver and the perceive separate. You can kind of and it has working memory that allows for a lot more deliberation. So what you get with birds and mammals is a much better ability for the perceiver to hold the idea, retrieve relevant information, and then simulate it for possible decisions. Am I going to go after this prey? Am I going to find this mate? Am I going to store this here or eat it now? They'll deliberate, and you need the cortex for that. So that by that time you get really inner subjective experience, where you have a perceiver perceived and the emergence of a core self that has a working memory. So I believe we go from flashes of basically broadcast functions. These things get consolidated to use predictions and to see what the animal can afford. And then as the cortex enlarges, they then start simulating. You get an inner perceptual eye, perceiver, that's separite from the perceived. And that's what we get to see.
And then basically, what this is kind of cool. I'm just kind of grokking the underlying it. Basically, what you guys are talking about is like, okay, if we're going to ask like the problem of consciousness, right? How did we get to consciousness, right? What do we mean by all that? Like, basically, you're saying if we go back down to the very, very fundament of life, right? That it's pain and pleasure, basically, light and dark, right, if you will, right?
I'd put it slightly this way. There's an approach avoidance at the fundament of life. There's the mechanisms of metabolic flow that has to acquire energy. And it's probably the case that all at bacterial level, single cell bacterial level, it's all a biocybernetic molecular there's a subjective processing of forms,
Yeah.
but there probably isn't subjective conscious
Yeah.
experience of being in bacteria. Okay?
Totally.
So, but you see a lot of what I call they demonstrate functional awareness and response. This is where the term consciousness is really confusing. It's like, yeah, you can see functional awareness in somebody else, and you see it in a bacteria. You know,
Yeah.
When you cut your hand and it gets better, your skin is showing functional awareness and response.
Right. So like consciousness is something like but basically it's out of this ever increasing complexity that starts basically there.
Exactly. And I think you need, in those cells, you need all of that sense of approach avoid. And then what happens in consciousness when we move to mind, you get a brain that serves as this broadcast function.
Yeah.
Okay? And I like to argue that the brain is actually the skin folded upon its inside itself. So this is like an inversion of the skin.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And then it creates an inner stadium, basically, where each neuron is like a fan in a stadium. And then it sends out waves and it charges waves and it creates like a wave function in the stadium that the stadium can then pay attention to. When it makes broadcasts, global neural work means that it's bringing, like your desktop, it brings interface of that particular focal entity with the rest of the brain system. So it can interface with it. That's what the global workspace means, that it's a workspace that is globally accessible and creating interface with other various parts of the domain, the brain. And so that's the argument is that pleasure pain really does that.
Put. The skin like a neuron is something like a skin, that your skin folded in on itself, so you can, and then building a stadium on top of that. That's interesting. That's a trippy visual.
It is. Right? And that's where you've been living your whole life, guys.
Totally makes sense. Everything makes sense now, Gregg. Wow.
Coasting across the stadium of an inverted skin system.
Yes, totally. So, and also one of the things I want to comment too is it sounds like literally the process that you and John were doing, it sounds like literally was the literal dialectic, right?
It was, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, literally, like he was presenting his arguments.
Actually, I'll finish share the screen and I'll come back and we can summarize that point, because if you see the screen, it all comes together. So behavioral investment theory then forms this whole evolutionary behavioral base for the cognitive structure of the nervous system now to operate across hierarchy. So this is why it serves as the base. And John's SIM3R is really, this hierarchical level corresponds very directly to it. Okay. So that's what we were excited about. Then we've talked some about the influence matrix. Okay? Yeah. The influence matrix is this map of our relationship system.
Right.
That I developed. Well, now hanging with John, I could see that really what this maps is, it's the frame for how we detect relational recursive relevance realization. And so I can now, this is the architecture. So what the black line means, and this template is, you are tracking what is relevant is whether or not you're loved and whether you have high social influence. You have intuitive tracking for that, whether or not you're getting rejected and people are, and then how are you in the social space? Where am I in position to you? Am I close to you? Am I above you? Are we? And so it's essentially the architecture of relational recursive relevance realization.
Interesting.
So with that, then I mean, for the whole week, I was like, oh my God, I can now fine tune my, what actually the perceptual side of the matrix is doing. So it was, that showed you the synergy. So I was able to help John understand sort of the behavioral base and jump from valence qualia to the base of participatory. Then John's using his recursive relevance realization. I said, the matrix is really about relational recursive relevance realization. And then, you and I have certainly talked about, the fact that justification system theory, this theory of propositional knowing, that then turns us into these primates that do recursive rational relevance realization and all that. But then all of a sudden we create propositional semantic knowledge systems, and they have a particular structure. And the justification system theory tells us how that popped in the, it gives us a frame then to put Descartes' mind on top of the animal perceiving mind. It all all seem to go together pretty well. That's
Right.
So we covered that that was a summary slide that said, hey, so I developed these 4 key ideas, and then John's idea, boom, for cognition just clicks right in. And so now you have a meta theory of cognitive science, a meta theory of organizing psychology with the metaphysics of mind all lined up. We can actually tell people what consciousness is in a naturalistic, psychology, human science sense.
Interesting.
Clarity.
Interesting. Wow. Wow. And have you, so this is kind of a, have you, is the hard problem been solved?
Not exactly.
Okay.
The hard problem's been clarified, and huge chunks of it have been resolved or dissolved.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So here's the hard problem is Hohn's, to use that language, it's David Chalmers' language.
Yeah.
Okay? And that is this question of subjective experience. Like, how the hell does that happen? Okay?
Yeah.
Now, I emphasize that one of our confusions is there's 2 aspects of the hard problem. Okay? One is epistemological, and the other is ontological, and those often get confused.
Yeah.
Okay? So, epistemological means that if we're used to science being the way we decide what's real true, okay, science epistemology is based on third-person objectification.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? The whole language game of science.
Yeah.
It is an epistemologically brute fact that
you
can't see first person from third person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the language of science, by its very definition, has an enormous barrier here with this problem. Okay? So
right.
It's sort of like another way of thinking about it. It's like science is about describing, explaining what is. It's got serious problems he has to determine morality.
Yeah.
Science doesn't tell us what ought to be. Science also doesn't tell us what subjectivity looks like.
Yeah.
From it, just doesn't allow us to consider that, only indirectly. So so that's an epistemological problem. The other thing is the ontological problem. It is the case that we have a lot of correlatory knowledge, meaning we can line up neurological correlates with features of cognition and consciousness and say, oh, hey, actually, the optic tectum and its connection to aspects of the early affective limbic system is really where you get good integration in animals before mammals. Okay? So that's what, hey, yeah, we can do. But we have no idea whether the optic tectum would produce consciousness in fish, okay? Because we don't understand why we just look at what things do and correlate whether they're consciousness. We don't have any mechanism theory of neurobiology that explains how the subjective experience of being is tied together through that electrical activity. We just don't understand. And that to give rise to the first person, it's a mystery. Is that why aren't we just meat robots?
Totally.
We don't know.
Right.
And so that mechanism problem remains very, very tricky. So I would argue that no, there's parts of it that remain. However, much of the consciousness problem was the language problem and a meta theory problem. And I think John and I together show that we can box the language game in and give proper meta theory. And that's a big deal.
And possibly with what you guys got clarified and synthesized, right? Like, would you say, does this give more basis upon which to approach that problem, you think?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And for me, it's more that I'm very conscious of how confused we are about mind and matter just in everyday world. Okay? People, the populace is very confused about it. And I really believe our meaning and mental health problems come from our inability to understand what science says about our conscious worlds in a way that affords meaning in everyday life effectively, in a way that allows us to understand it. So part of the whole problem is that there has been, if we looked at the right way, that's what John and I are saying, there's a language we can extract and give to people that makes sense.
Right.
And
to
so
then,
we certainly, to be like, oh, okay, so wait a minute, mind two, like we should have the mind three, mind two, mind one. You know, you hear all the time people say, well, you can never see the mind. It's like, well, actually, I don't know what you're talking about there. You just made a comment of your mind. I can see what you just said.
Yeah.
I can see some of your mind, right?
Totally. Okay, got you. Okay. Interesting.
So it's really the tool to talk about it. And I believe that's a huge deal. Because I mean, I talk to people that don't know what emotions are. They don't know what their feelings are. And this is really, I blame us, the academy, and the social sciences, behavioral sciences. We can't figure out how do we talk about it. How do we teach other people how to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the talking about it's a big deal.
Right. So like kind of what, do you have any speculations just around, well, how, like, why is it, or what, is that the right question? Why is it, does a conscious self come into being, right? Like, what would you say, what's your sense of like the direction of the answer to that question, and the explanation of that question is? Do you have something like that? A hunch about it?
Well, I think that our structure function at the outline level is pretty good, in the sense that what consciousness does is it focally organizes the animal and allows you to broadcast and distribute, allows you to integrate information and broadcast and distribute it. Okay? So at a functional level, why consciousness in this view is definitely not epiphenomenal. It's something nature needed to do. Okay? And what it needed to do with more complex dynamic behavioral controls, where I'm one animal, I have to get all this stuff and I have to decide whether I'm going this way to the T maze or this way as one animal. Okay? I need to decide what I'm relating to you right now, not all the other stuff. So I need a focal organizing, top down, bottom up system of recursive relevance realization, basically. Right. Then what consciousness is about is because the requirement of focality, meaning you have to be specific and framed on a particular task. Okay. And we see that surprise and focus are the key elements that draw what consciousness will come on. So if you can predict what you're doing and you're automatically in your procedural mode, you're not very conscious. Okay. But if you're honing into control and or you're surprised, you'll see that's where, and consciousness fundamentally is about orienting to pull the focal element and then gain more control over it and ability to anticipate. Right.
Totally. Interesting. Because isn't it one of the things that consciousness affords? I know Heidegger really, he hardly ever talked about consciousness. And in fact, he thought that metaphysically it was such a problematic term that he stopped talking about consciousness and all of that, right? And I don't know if I quite totally understand it, but I think it's
a very what happens because of the Enlightenment gap is because it's a very corrupted term. It's a very corrupted term, and it's very slippery because people both mean the referent and they mean the process. And normally in the process, it's the awareness, okay? And the referent is the experience, but the ratio and the relationship between recursive awareness on the experiential referent is very confusing. Both inside the animal, meaning they're hierarchical giraffes. Lower level systems are then being modeled by upper level systems. So there's a recursive feedback loop. Okay? That is that I have limbic systems that are tracking my whole body and creating an affective gestalt that's good or bad. Okay? Then that gets consolidated into my perceptible knowing, my perceive relation mostly in my right hemisphere. And then on top of that, I got my narrator recursively narrating what it is the hell I'm seeing and doing.
Totally.
So there's experience and awareness layers all around there. Well, what is consciousness? It depends on whether we're talking about process of awareness. Like you get into this and there's things like conscious access. Do you mean that the person experienced it, or that they have access to that they experienced it? Right. So totally. That's a different thing, it's like, and then, so there's all of this. If you don't know, well, it's just a potential landmine. So it becomes unbelievably equivocating and confusing about what actually is the reference point that you're talking about. Different people have different references in mind, so they use the term and they I get taught that Rene Descartes said animals have no consciousness, and that George Romanes said, oh my God, they do. but actually because he meant the experience of being in pleasure and pain, the perception of it, that's what he meant. Whereas Rene Descartes meant awareness and reasoning about the perception.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
But actually he agreed that they didn't have secondary
Right.
awareness and cultural sophistication about reasoning about their perception.
Yeah.
So they actually both agreed. They just meant
Totally.
things by the term conscious. So
Well,
it does require a lot of refinement.
I've been reading this book, so some of this is really kind of like pretty
Brilliant.
salient to me right now. And it's basically
yes,
he in a way that's kind of distinctive than he did in Being Time, but I think it's the first. I think it was this course he taught right after the publication, right? So it's got some historical interesting things about it. But one of the things that really popped for me in that was where he was talking about, that metaphysics really like, essentially it's the problem of like consciousness and transcendence, right? And what he basically shows, right? And he thought this has been the confusion, right? In terms of Rene Descartes and then Kant and this whole, like all the way to Hegel, right? Is this basically thing of like, how do you account for, like, if there's a separation between subject and object, right? How do you account for that relationship? How does that happen? And you end up with all these dichotomies, and then you have Kant saying things like, well, we can't know the thing in itself. And basically he kind of traces back the history and shows essentially, and that's Heidegger. So it's, it's not obvious what he's saying. I don't even know if it's obvious what he's saying to him, right?
He is notoriously thick to read.
Yeah, but strikingly concrete and simple, right? And basic in the realm that he's dealing with, right? Basically he says that, okay, Dasein, right, is transcendence, right? He's saying basically like that that the problem is that we have not noticed, right, that if it's not for the particular how and what of human being, right, that only happens, right? In other words, if objects and beings, if being and world and all that stuff happen at all, it's already been constituted in transcendence. That's what allows them to emerge and occur, right? And he says basically, like, what we've been trying to do is understand the human being as the end result of that process. But human being is actually transcendence itself, right? In this way, and it's, I mean, it's a. And of course, for some reason, I started having fell into a practice of reading that book first thing in the morning. So, which is interesting.
Amen. Amen. Yeah.
So I get his concerns, I think, grab, because first thing in the morning, it is the morning, because you haven't all your concerns aren't taken up by facticity. So if you read Being in Time, all of a sudden, like, his concerns become yours, and you're like, holy cow.
Wake up, people.
Like, you have these like manic, like, I send these manic texts to my friends, and they get concerned about me, right?
I was doing that to John when I went through the wisdom energy thing.
Yes, totally.
I was like, John, it's like, I found a new nugget. I was like, oh God. It's like, sorry, I know I'm hypomanic, but you'll just have to cope.
So right there, that's the thing I wanted to circle back around, the wisdom energy. What was the thing that you got? Can you go in? Can you share with us a little bit about what that is and what you mean by it?
Yep. So all right. So kind of my journey's always been this interface. Like, it starts in the therapy room. People are suffering. What the hell do you do? Okay. And then it's like, wait a minute, I want to obtain knowledge so that I can then bring knowledge to translate what's going on and make wise decisions in the therapy room.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's gain scientific knowledge so you make better, wise decisions. That's been the whole. Yeah. And then I fell into the whole of, well, what is the science, the psychology, etc. So now I'm on a knowledge quest. Okay? Yeah. And then I pull out a new way to think about knowledge totally. Right? That's what the tree of knowledge is, a theory of knowledge.
Yeah.
all right, which is the knower-known relation.
That arose for you out of dealing with pain, basically, which is the whole thing.
Yeah, about how to how to deal with pain, exactly, in the real world.
Yeah.
And then what is this? And then actually going to bring the thing towards psychology. Oh my God, nobody knows what psychology is. There's the enlightenment gap. And then voila, the tree of knowledge actually bridges the enlightenment gap and says proper relations of matter and mind and science and society. Tells you what it is. Which we have lacked, and it's a miracle. Woohoo! So then, then my next phase after the tree of knowledge then is really building the unified theory of psychology. Okay. Then I come back and build the unified approach, which is to get back in the therapy room and then apply this. Okay?
Yeah.
Then that's like from 2011, 2016. And then 2016 is when I got catapulted into the garden. Okay. And then in 2018, 19, I get catapulted really out of the academy and I'm hanging out with you guys.
Right. Just real quick. The garden is
the garden's that.
Okay. The tree of, yes.
Which is the theory of knowledge tree and the whole, this is a whole map of the academy and the philosophy, the whole wisdom philosophy is the garden. Okay? Yeah. And the idea here is this: I found the tree of knowledge and then ultimately cultivated a garden wisdom because it allows the return to paradise, because we can actually now have knowledge and then sort out good and evil and move from good and away from evil. That's for following the imagery. It's tree of knowledge into the garden of Atua, which is akin to Eden, and we can now return to Eden with wisdom. That's the idea.
Right.
Because now I'm returning how to now metabolize the knowledge and transform it into. There's wise adaptive living, like in the psychotherapy room. That's one domain. But now my concern isn't so much psychotherapy and inside the academy what psychology is, but now it's like we're in the axial age transition. Everybody's facing a meaning crisis. It's fifth joint point stuff. It's happening now. The whole system is in flux, and we need a total upgrade, a meta-modern upgrade in our understanding of knowledge writ large and wise ways of being in the world. Right? Like we need to fundamentally figure out a new way of a new character and lifestyle, because the current one is getting transformed. Okay? So then it's like, well, how do you take this a cathedral of knowledge, but the full point of it is that how do we relate to our hearts, our natures, each other, the world, the past, and the future, in a way that's oriented towards fulfillment. I mean, that's what the psychotherapy quest is. That's what, how do I live my best life and be a good ancestor? That's the easiest way I put it. And that's so that's always been, so the garden then is this wisdom philosophy. Okay. Well, I went through some stuff this last year, as you know. I went through, and then I was also, a couple of things were lining up for me in September. So I was coming out of that. I'd had a little mini dark night of soul stuff. I was getting more, I was now healthily metabolizing that scene when I was growing around. And so I had a new and very present relationship to injury and my soul, and how to get more healthier and deeper relations to that. And my friend Rob Scott, who's part of the whole TOK, regular contributor TOK, is a coach, and he had a very, very powerful model.
Real quick, TOK is what?
Theory of Knowledge Society.
Okay, gotcha. Yes, the thing I visited that one time. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And he presented, and he and I have been looking. So he's an autodidact. He's totally trained himself. Went through a horrible life, and then sort of stumbled across some real awakening philosophies, and then he coaches people in them. And basically, it's a very sophisticated sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, if you put it in a class, into the Eastern traditions of how to get in touch with the first person experience of being, being itself. And then get situated in what he calls isness, or being itself. And what he believes, like the Stoics and so much suffering is about really the delusional meaning-making systems that people put on the experience, and all their fears and all their worries and everything else. And the fundamental shift is how to get yourself situated in isness itself, the psychophysical experience of being. Okay. And then engage in identity shifting, which is pulling healthy lenses that allow you to pragmatically solve problems towards valued states of being, basically.
And make sure you're worried about the right thing.
make sure you're worried about the right thing. So the first thing, though, what he says is basically drop your delusions of belief, get centered in what is, okay, at the fundamental, and then operate from there.
Right.
So he and I had some of that, but he was teaching me how he does it, and that was affording me better contact with my experience of being.
And was that like in teaching you, was he teaching you kind of like, is it meditative techniques? Like, what does that look like? Like, how was he, what things was he showing you?
He focuses, yes, he has some back to breath exercises. So certainly some get in touch with breath. He is trained himself in terms of giving very good, actually it's sort of kind of like I do in therapy, he gives very good analysis of what's going on, and then how. So he walks you through how to drop into experience. So he gives just a few, and I've done a lot of this, but the way he was framing it put a couple of pieces at another level of clarity. And actually I get to a point like through the wisdom energy stuff. Okay, I start syncing up. So wisdom energy ultimately, there's a couple of pieces to fill in, but I'll just say it's a way of fundamentally connecting the tree of knowledge as its sort of essence points. It starts with energy, okay, and then what's goal really is wisdom. So these are the two kind of poles of how do you evolve into wisdom. And by energy, I do mean just the capacity to do work. That's the physics. And I also mean the ultimate substance of the universe. So what I am basically saying is I'm attaining energy and transforming it into the experience and work of being a particular way, i.e. embodying wisdom.
Right.
That's
Totally.
And then I was catching that and doing it like in the moment. So that's like, I built the tree of knowledge and then I let the tree of knowledge go because the schema allowed me to cohere all the way down. And then as I told Rob, I was loving being without memory or desire. Loving being without memory or desire.
Loving being without memory or desire. Right.
Exactly. So I was having, and this is when I was walking my dog. All right. And it was in a total gross consciousness state, meaning I was just normal every day, but it was also transcendent. So it's in relationship to like Heidegger, it's like I was transcendence right there. And it was not in anything other than the experience itself and the love and awe of it.
Totally.
But with full gross consciousness. Okay. Not like I didn't have to do any meditation or anything. And the logos of the tree of knowledge was just shining that. So it was obtain knowledge and then release it into wisdom energy.
Okay. And so tell me just so I can get clear. It's like, so what do you mean like the difference between attaining knowledge and then releasing it into wisdom energy? Is that where is it something like it shifts from foreground to background and then draws forward the foreground in terms of, but it functions as the background, kind of in a sense.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. So I am a very, my doctoral student's very well trained in the yoga Hindu tradition. She's like, you're following the path of wisdom through the intellect, Gregg. Okay? So she's telling me about the various energies. Okay. Ayurveda tradition or other kinds of things. And I got a lot of head energy.
Right.
And that's totally true. Okay?
Right.
But what this was doing, so if you hear me, it's like, oh, I can solve the problem of justification, and here's the tree of knowledge. In other words, everything's conceptual coherence. And if you come to me as a therapist, that's what my great strengths are. You get a lot of brilliant, but it's also the case that there are a lot of other ways of being. So, embodying itself and all of that.
Right.
So this, for me, what this was I was catching the transition out of head back into heart and being itself. So that was the dissolution of the ego.
Right.
That was in a gross conscious state. And now I can contact that. Like I'll just be walking since this happened. I'll just be like, just have the moment of awe of existence itself and the love of that feeling. So you just really, it's a wonderful feeling. I mean, if you just tap into that and you're like, just everyday experiences now, it just can be just beautiful and awe-inspiring.
And that's,
I was drinking off of that.
Right.
I was psyched about it. And still in. That's a good thing.
So it's kind of like, is it fair to say that there's that experience that you can tap into, right? I get the sense of like, is that it's there's something about that that affords that there is. Like I keep thinking about the sense of not just focused on what is, like the what's, which is mostly like, you know, what obsessive, like, but that there is anything at all. I always thought that, yeah, it's funny. I always thought that the sense of like, I always thought that gratitude, talking about gratitude as a feeling isn't really isn't the right way to talk about it. It's more like gratitude is simply the recognition of that there is, because you can't get underneath that mystery.
It is right. Totally. That's why it's an inexhaustible mystery. Ego dissolution and just presence with it all.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, that's like,
yeah.
So I can now, and it's so, obviously I work with people all the time and totally trapped in their head. Everything's miserable. I can't do this. I'm stressed about this. And of course that's, you know, there is ways to frame the world that's very stressful that I can empathize with a lot of ease. But it's also, if you have access to this is great. Right? I mean, if all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I live in my experience of being just with a savoring gratitude of this sip of coffee or my petting my dog Benji. It's just a felt sense of peace.
Yeah.
And for me, I've tapped into that in the last 3 months in a deeper, it's gone deeper just into the heart of being, and the head is like no meaning to have, you know, it's, I don't have the, oh, did I get this all right? And put all the pieces in. It's like, it's fine and important and crucial to my own journey was part of that thing, but it was just sort of like, oh, now I'm back here and now I'm down here.
Yeah.
I'm in the cells.
And what would you say was the difference that made that difference, that allowed this for you to get access to this? And is it a feeling for you? Is it an experience of something is there that wasn't there before? Or is it more of a feeling of like, no, it was there before, I just couldn't find it or didn't know to find it or something?
Yeah, this was a clearer path to something that was there before, definitely in this case. You know, and the way I didn't mention this, but there was some of the stuff I do with this iQuad coin, and I have this ways of, I listened to a Portal episode with Eric Weinstein and Roger Penrose, and they were talking about this thing called this Riemann sphere, which is a mathematical operator, and that actually, and then I read this article on wisdom and was talking on about it, and so there was an intellectual path that was, I made a few more abstract connections that allowed me to fuse knower and physics together in a just another way of bottom up, top down clarity. And the way that, I can't get into the specifics, but the way I made that click was then the sort of the intellectual enterprise. It was sort of like you climb up to a mountain, the intellectual enterprise is done, and then it just released and then fell back into being itself. You know, it's like,
and brought with it everything. Brought with it,
right, coherent integration. It brought with it that sense of oneness of like, oh, and then it just like from the pinnacle of abstraction, then down into the particulate of my psychophysical experience of being self, and all with ease. It was all that flow experience of like, this normally be really hard, but it is just coming. It's my getting scale invariant multi-level modeling. Like everyone's getting it right away.
Right, totally.
A couple of week period where it's like, hey, we are singing the same fucking tune here. That's all the levels. It's like, all right, that's good. That's nice.
So this is just, first of all, I just feel super celebratory just for you. Like my friend Gregg's like having this experience of being, right? Kind of transcendent and including of everything. It's just more available. And is that the sense of it? Is that like, just when you look, you can, that there's something you can contact?
Right. For me, what was interesting, I get transcendent oneness. That's what sort of the iQuad represents. I get conceptual transcendent oneness and have in the past. One of the things that was really cool for me is, you know, I emphasize dignity, well-being, and integrity, but I also say, you know, freedom and love. There are all these other things. I was getting massive love hits So this is so oneness with love, and the love of simplicity, and it was this agape philia kind of like fellowship, and I want to give
Suchness,
love to it, and
right.
it was definitely that. So I haven't had a lot of and that's why I called John. I was like, because what happened was I texted him, and then he's like, oh, Gregg, Gregg's doing weird shit again. And then it's like, wait a minute, Gregg sometimes does weird shit and it pays off. And then it caught his curiosity. He texted me back. He's like, I think you're describing chi and Taoism. That's what he said. I was like, oh, really? And then I Googled it, and then it's wisdom energy, the path to Buddhism. So I was like, okay, Taoism, Buddhism, and then philosophia. What is philosophia? It's loving wisdom, or putting your energy into loving wisdom and getting wisdom energy back. So I'm like, oh my God, this concept is seemingly everywhere.
Right. So. And for you, there really was there was a conceptual part of it. Like I could feel that, because I've sensed that with you. I think we've talked about this before, where it seems like you're, the tree of knowledge in your work and your theory, right, is, well, what is it what ultimately called it forth, right? It always occurred to me that I bet this is like your way of loving reality, right?
Yeah, no, well, that's exactly what it was, and that's what I was saying. I was struck by that tone exactly. The hedonic tone of love was very
and that for you there really was that thing about like these two things coming together and working it out, that it clicked in such a way that's just really interesting. I'm fascinated by the experience of how that then just dropped in and cohered all the way up. So it kind of it emerges up, but you got there through like working all of that out. That's quite cool, to say the least.
Yeah, thanks. It was very cool, and I'm still getting cool echoes off of it.
Yeah.
But that was it. Yes, it's like like a water slide. Climb up the water slide of knowledge, and then let it go all down.
Right. Totally.
Like, totally. And drop it. Oh my God! It's like I can almost forget that I did it, but somehow I'm now aligned with it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I'm really interested in this too, because there is this sense I've noticed is that this experience that I have. I mean, more and more, it seems to be more accessible or more regular, is that I can count on that if I go deep into some like rich conversation or rich line of questioning that are just on one level, they're super abstract. When I stop the conversation or I move out of that mode and then I look at everything, all the particulars, there's something that glows through it, right? There's like if you in some sense, if you kind of grapple with your mortality, or you just like these very kind of somewhat abstract things, somehow by diving into that, I've always noticed that there is a sense when you could say I return back to my life implicitly in a way that I don't have to construct or think about, like it glows through the particulars. Like it's like somehow the whole glows through all of it. Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, so until you use the word grapple, it's interesting because when you're doing the abstraction, okay, you're putting forms to things and putting pieces together. And really what you're trying to do is build a model that allows you to gain grip of self in relationship with the world.
Yeah.
And we're doing it at the level of justification when you're in your dialogos. Right. But there's also the perceptual gestalts that are happening.
Right.
And if you pull, if resonance happens, then the form of the top down and the bottom up get aligned, and the glow is the signature of the new grip that you've pulled.
Yeah.
And now you see the world with another level of resolution.
Yes, totally. Because that's always been this one of the things I've noticed about working with people for like 20 years is that when people, you can tell how a kind of a transformation is happened is because they can see different, like they literally, they look at the same thing and they see it differently. They hear it differently. They, right? So that's really that kind of motion. Because I think there's also this thing where I mean, one of the things that was cool about doing that writing that paper for the anthology that we did was this of writing that intensely in that way was really kind of finding out like, oh yeah, the writing is this process of discovering what you're writing about. Like that's what makes it so not linear on some level, right? And frustrating sometimes. But so I've been thinking about the next thing I want to write, and I think I'm starting to get a beat on it, and I think it's something about this, right? Something about this sense, and is it Pierre Hadot who talks about philosophy as a way of life, right? That traditionally philosophy has been viewed not as an academic thing, but as a more like almost like a mystical practice in some sense, right? And you know, he's talking about like we kind of lost that sense. And there's a way he talks about where I really get it. But there's some part of it that in my experience, there's something that's not totally hitting it. And I think it has something to do with this quality of that it's like a philosophy is in a certain sense, philosophy can be seen as a way of existing, right?
Right.
Like, in fact, it's particularly human, right?
Yes.
The evoking the wonder. So in some sense, it's philosophy in some sense to be a human being. It's not a conversation that you can or can't have. Like on some level, if you're perceiving anything, if you're oriented to the world, right, you're living on off of presuppositions and historical reference points that are like it's to be is to in some senses to be precisely with what philosophy grapples with, right?
Totally.
And so in my experience with philosophy has been because I have not gotten it through the academia. I think it's been a lot more of a sense of like just me contending with myself, and when we started circling and just not exactly knowing why I'm reading this stuff and doing this, but there's somehow that it connects. Totally. But I want to kind of restore that sense of it, right?
I would. 100%. This is what the meaning crisis is, and then the question is, we're wandering out with religions that don't, we're missing our religion or philosophy of life. For the 21st century,
right?
And that was so gratifying to me is that I was now embodying the experiential consequence, right, of the philosophy, because that's so much of what academic philosophy, like analytic philosophy, is so far removed from the problem of life.
Right.
I mean, it's like, oh my God, these guys do powerful logical analysis, but it's like, we have really, we are desperately needing philosophy of life for the 21st century.
Right.
That guides and coordinates us at the various local and global scales of being. And that's, that both is analytic in terms of, yes, here's a map of coherence and knowledge, and also phronesis and applied, and speaks very much to, whether you're happy or miserable walking your dog, because you're either have reciprocal opening and can, appreciate with gratitude, or you're bitter and resentful that people aren't paying attention to your work and wondering about how you can advance in the world.
Right.
It's a totally different frame of reference.
Totally. And that quality of wonderment, the simple sense of existing, right, and the utter inexhaustible mystery of that in a place of wonderment, right, is to me that's out of which it makes sense that we can ask these questions, right? They beg also the other end too, which is suffering, right, is another way that often happens with that, is like through looking at something hurts. What's going on here?
Yeah, of course.
But just that, and so I want to get that sense because Yeah, and it's not I think it's more like philosophia, the spirit of
Mhm,
philosophia, right? But as a mode of existing, that
mhm.
that to be human, right? If you don't do it consciously, you will have a view of the world, right? Right? You
Of
will have
course.
a
Yeah, no doubt.
all of that. So
Absolutely.
to not really take it up, right? In some senses, not to take up your own being, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And
And
that's really
yeah,
what I see for me. That's the a great way of characterizing what we're trying to do with dialogos
yep,
and all of this and circling
yep.
is basically we need to create new pathways so people can develop philosophies of lives for
Hmm.
themselves and the community
Yeah,
and ways of being. That's definitely what's needed.
right, right. So good talking with you, my friend.
Amen. Good way to
Nice
start the
catch up.
year.
Nice catch up.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, really appreciate your work. Really appreciate you. And like, I feel super, my heart opens just hearing
Well,
you
thank
talk
you,
about
Gregg.
like yours opening in a way that
Hmm.
sounds pretty fundamental.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It always nourishes my soul to touch him with God. So thank you so much, friend. I appreciate
Okay.
our conversations.
Mwah. All
All
right.
right.
Let's do it again soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Amen.